friends, hello there. It is December. Can you believe it? If you're actually watching or listening to this on the release date, it's not only December, it's actually Giving Tuesday that is in December this year. And if you have been following our series, you will know that in our last episode, we talked a little bit about Black Friday, Small Business Saturday, Cyber Monday, and Giving Tuesday. And one of the things that we briefly mentioned in the Giving Tuesday portion is that when it comes to just giving in general, I believe God calls us to be people who are very generous with what we have. And so I always encourage people, give to something you're passionate about, give to something that's having impact, give to something you believe God is calling you to give to. And notice I didn't say give to Walking the Text. I just said, just give. But one of the ways that we have been trying to help people to understand the impact that Walking the Text is having through you and with your involvement is by putting together a year-end impact report. And so for those of you who are on our mailing list, you received this last week. And if you haven't had a chance to look it over, just wanted to let you know that we have released it. It'll help you to better understand what's unfolding at Walking the Text. And if you desire to give on Giving Tuesday to, a nonprofit organization like Walking the Text, great. If you're giving to another organization, great. But as you think about your year-end giving as well, we just want to help you to better understand what your partnership with Walking the Text is doing and the kind of impact it's having all around the world. So you can access that at walkingthetext.com/2019 report, or you can snag that on our donate page at walkingthetext.com. Alrighty, well, I am super excited to jump back into this parable of the rich fool because this is a season of giving. Whether we're coming on the heels of Thanksgiving or moving into Christmas or, it's Giving Tuesday, it is a season where we're reminded of what we have, and we're reminded that we are called to be generous in at all times, not just this time of year. And so there's a really interesting facet of this parable that speaks into this idea, and I want to look at that with you in today's episode. So we are in Luke chapter 12. It's the only gospel that has this particular parable, and this is part 2 in our series on the rich fool. And let's just start again in verse 13, where the story that leads up to the giving of the parable begins. It says, "Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, 'Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me.' And Jesus replied, 'Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?' And then Jesus says, 'Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in an abundance of possessions.'" And in our first episode that we looked at within this series, we talked about Jesus' words here in greater detail. And we talked about the idea that we can become possessed by our possessions. That possessions are a good thing if we use them well. But for many of us, we're just not even aware of how our possessions are possessing us. And so we were challenged around this idea in part 1 of this series. But notice how then we jump back into the parable itself, and let's talk a little bit more about possessions and a different facet that Jesus is making blatantly clear in this parable for anyone who has eyes or ears to hear. And I mean by eyes as we read this. So here we go. It says this, "And Jesus told them this parable. The land of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. And he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops.'" So this is how Jesus begins the parable, and right away, I believe Jesus' audience would have picked up on something. And this is what I believe they would have picked up on. Notice how it says that it yielded an abundant harvest. But it's actually specifically highlighting it was the land who yielded an abundant harvest. You go, well, what's significant about that? Hang with me for a few moments. And then notice what the rich man says as a result of his land producing this abundant harvest. He says, "What shall I do? Notice all the I and my language here. What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. It's the land that yielded the harvest, but his response is, these are my crops. It doesn't say he yielded an abundant harvest. It says the land. And then notice what happens next. Then he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. Everything here is my. And then Jesus goes on with the rest of the parable. The man will then say, I will say to my soul. Now that's a fascinating connection. We have my goods, my crops, and then he says, my soul. And we're going to talk about this in the next episode. But he says, soul, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your soul will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. Now again, this story, this parable really picks up steam, at least for our episode here, is when the dude says, these are my crops. So why is this problematic? Why am I making such a big deal about this? Why do I believe Jesus intentionally put this language on the rich man's mouth? And how would have Jesus' audience understood or would have felt the tension with what Jesus was sharing in this story? Well, friends, it goes back to what is said in the Hebrew scriptures about the world, about what we own, about property. It's in many places the people knew their own Bible and they knew what God had said and what others had said. So let's start in 1 Chronicles 29:11. This is King David. And at one point he is offering this prayer and he says to God, he says, yours, Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the majesty and the splendor. For everything in heaven and earth is yours. Yours, Lord, is the kingdom. You are exalted as head over all. What a great prayer, right? It's such an amazing and astounding prayer. But I want to highlight for you that in it he says, for everything in heaven and earth is yours. That's on the lips of David. Now, this is on the lips of the psalmist in Psalm 24:1. Just very succinctly says this, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So this is what the psalmist is identifying, is that like everything belongs to God. The world is God's and everything in it. Now, if we go back a little bit further and we jump into Leviticus, we get something very helpful about how God is speaking, not just about the world as a whole and everything in it, but specifically about land, which is the object of the parable as it begins. In Leviticus 25:23-24, God is speaking through Moses here, and he says, the land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine. And you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. Throughout the land that you hold as possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. So God says, this is my land, and I'm allowing you to reside, in my land. And yes, you are possessing it, but God is saying you don't own it. It's mine. Right, friends, when it comes to what we have, when it comes to the land, when it comes to anything, friends, we don't own it. This is what I believe, God is clearly communicating here in Leviticus, and this is the witness of the story of the Bible around what we have. In fact, we could say it this way, that what we have, we do not own. We merely steward on God's behalf. It's all God's. Everything is God's. We get to possess it, but what we possess, we don't own. We merely steward on God's behalf. We are God's managers. Now, invariably, when you talk about something like this, you will come across, the individual who will go, okay, I'm not sure I really like that. Like, I have worked hard, I have gotten my hands dirty, I have pulled myself up by my bootstraps, I have worked long and hard to get what I have. I'm not sure I like where this is going. Now, what's fascinating is that God knew exactly that would be the propensity for some of us as we think through what we have, what we possess, our monies, our possessions, our accolades, our achievements, our jobs, whatever we kind of take stock in. There was a moment where God spoke to Israel because he had this very same concern that they would move in that direction. And so in Deuteronomy, God is speaking to them. And in Deuteronomy chapter 8, God goes on this helpful rant about how he is concerned that once they get into the land, because when God is speaking to them in Deuteronomy, they haven't gotten into the promised land yet. And that they're going to, have these fields and just these abundant crops, and they may have really nice things, and they may forget the Lord their God. And multiple times God goes, you're going to forget me. And then in Deuteronomy 8 verses 17 to 18, there's a point where God says this. He says, you may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth. Right, there might be a point where you go, it is my power, it is the strength of my hands. I have done this. I have acquired. I have achieved. I have pulled myself up by the bootstraps. And God's like, hold on a minute. Yes, that may be true, but recognize I am the one who even gives you the ability to produce wealth. I am the one who gives you the opportunities. I'm the one who gives you the intellect. And yes, there is a role we have to play in the process. That was made clear when we talked about the parable of the soils and about how we have a responsibility to prepare our field, right? To get the rocks out, to burn off all of the weeds and the thistles and all of that. Yes, we have a part to play, but at no point can we claim our achievements as our own, as if we are the ones solely responsible for whatever good thing comes our way. It's almost as if what God is saying here and reminding his people is that everything we have is a gift. Everything. The very breath that we just took is a gift. The very fact that we can move and live is a gift. The very fact that we can work and achieve and do things, that's a gift. All of life is a gift. And until we come to this recognition that everything is God's and that we're merely stewards, and that we receive everything from God as a gift, I think we are going to struggle in how generous we live to other people. In fact, just a couple of chapters later, here in Deuteronomy, after God is helping them to understand that what we have, we do not own, we merely steward on his behalf. In Deuteronomy 15, verses 7 to 8, God is again speaking through Moses to the people. He says, if anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns of the land the Lord your God has given you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward them. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. And I love the word picture that is here, the contrast that God brings out between tight-fisted and open-handed. And I think that for so many of us, because we've lost sight of the fact that what we have we do not own, we merely steward on behalf of God, is that in our sense of worry, in our sense of anxiety that we're not going to have what we need, or because we have acquired so much and our heart has led us in the direction of wanting more or fearing that we're going to lose what we have, it's so easy for us to have this tight-fisted mentality. It's like we're grasping and we're reaching for things, and once we get it, like we hold on tight, and then there may be these moments where God goes, I want you to give, like I want you to be generous. And it's like we struggle to do so because we think to ourselves, I don't want to give away my money. I don't want to give away my possessions. I don't want to give away maybe my influence in some way, shape, or form. And God's going, but wait a minute, like what you have, you do not own. Like you merely steward this on my behalf. And so if I am asking you to give, then don't be tight-fisted. Don't hold on white-knuckled, because I'm not asking you to give in order to make your life miserable. I'm asking you to give because there is life and joy when you open your hands and you live life open-handed. And this image that I found, I feel like just really captures it. You know, for those of you who are maybe just listening to, this particular teaching, it's a pair of open hands, but they're covered in dirt. And what I love about this picture is that we do get dirty, right? We do hard work. We do partner with God, but we don't do that so that we can hold on. We do it so that we can open up our hands. And whatever sweat equity, whatever hard work we have put in, we do so because God has given us the ability. And that in this season where we are more focused on generosity and giving, may we live our lives open-handed. And may we not just live our lives open-handed, on a Giving Tuesday or in a season of Thanksgiving or in a season of Christmas or end of the year giving. But I believe that, friends, we are called to live with open hands all year long. Because when we have our hands open, we recognize that we can also receive from God every good and perfect gift that He wants to offer. But when we receive from God, we don't own it, we just steward it. And we also have the amazing ability with open hands to not only receive from God, but to also pass it along to others. So friends, thanks so much for watching. Thanks for listening. May we live with open hands because we don't own it. And may we truly walk out this text well in our lives.